My name is Hannah Moore, and before we start our poetry lesson, I think it best I give you a quick lesson in history. In 1750, when I was young, girls' education was generally limited to the arts, such as dancing, painting, cooking, and even learning French to help allure potential husbands. The idea of teaching young ladies the masculine subjects, such as mathematics and classical languages, was seldom entertained and oftentimes frowned upon. My mother recognized my intellectual abilities early on and decided to teach me how to read by the time I was 3 or 4, but quickly realized I had already taught myself to read. Unlike my mother, my father, Jacob Moore, a schoolmaster, did not support the attitude of female education. In fact, he felt alarmed at how quickly I excelled in Latin and Greco-Roman history. As a young child, I also loved mathematics, another unfeminine subject. Unfortunately, at this time, Father quickly stopped math lessons, but thankfully allowed me to continue in Latin. Teaching was the only profession acceptable for women of neither the laboring nor aristocratic life, and this was the profession Father pushed all 5 of his daughters into. I believe frivolous education creates shallow women. When I taught, I emphasized the imagination, incorporating a variety of stories into my lessons, whether from the Bible, fairy tales, or nursery rhymes. As a young child, I also loved composing poems. I filled every scrap paper I could find with poems and essays, many pointing toward a moral lesson of some kind. In fact, later today, we are going to memorize a portion of one of my many anti-slavery poems. In 1759, my 4 sisters and I decided to open up this girls' school, and after 30 years of operation, we handed it over to your current headmistress, Miss Mills. Teaching was a fulfilling time in my life when I was able to instruct young ladies in literacy as well as dancing. For me personally, much of my writing stems from the sufferings around me that I sought to alleviate. From a young age, I immersed myself in the world of words. I quickly grew to be a well-known writer among London's high society. I was known for my wit, charm, and modesty. However, during my years in Bristol, I began to sense a greater calling to a more serious work in the ministry to others. It was at this time, after the death of mentor David Garrett, a friend, Francis Boscawen, gave me a copy of Cardiphonia, which was a collection of pastoral letters penned by John Newton, author of the hymn, Amazing Grace. Upon reading these, my life changed. I became convicted that my life in London was too filled with the frivolities of high society, such as card playing, theater, and the constant breaking of the Sabbath. I grew weary with the trappings of high society and began to pursue true Christianity. It was at this time I traveled to meet John Newton, a former captain of a slave ship. John Newton was the one who convinced me to devote my life to the reformation of British society. Let me paint a picture for you girls to help you better understand. As a goldfish swimming in a bowl does not know what water is, so a person living in the late 18th century Great Britain, immersed in economic and social structure, could not easily, if at all, see slavery for what it was. To do so required, it seemed, a certain kind of perceptiveness of mind and spirit. The slave trade was very acceptable by all and very advantageous for the nation of Great Britain. One could hardly imagine life without it. By the late 18th century, over 11 million African men, women, and children had been taken from Africa to be used as slaves in the West Indies. Great Britain was the highest superpower on earth, and its empire was built on the backs of slaves. Slave trade was acceptable by all. Many types of emotions reared up when this subject was brought before Parliament, such as fear, anger, and for some, relief. A dear friend, William Wilberforce, and member of the Abolitionist movement, joined with others like me in taking a stand to abolish slave trade. At age 21, William Wilberforce became a member of the Parliament. Did he but know it, he would soon dedicate his life and health to the cause of abolishing slave trade. Since the year 1787, year after year, Wilberforce put forth his bill to abolish slave trade, and year after year, it was defeated. An average man might have been dissuaded to give up this cause. However, William Wilberforce made it his life's mission. Finally, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act was carried by 283 votes as the House rose to its feet and cheered wildly. As great as a victory as this was for us, it was not a vote to abolish slavery as a whole, but rather slave trade. As William Wilberforce took a stand in Parliament, so I took a stand in society. Wilberforce expressed to me that we should endeavor to make a multifaceted campaign to enlist preachers, poets, and parliamentarians. I became known for carrying around pamphlets depicting the most horrific parts of slavery and showing anyone I could. The visual impacts of these drawings made it one of the most effective tools I had. When others saw the diagrams of the slave ships showing the suffocating, tight living conditions of the slaves as they were chained, which measured only about 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, they were appalled at such inhumane treatment. I often risked my own safety and reputation at dinner parties to show people the truth of slavery. It is still hard for me to understand how so many could ignore the sufferings of millions aboard the slave ships. For one, it was quite common that half of those who entered the ships would die along the way to the plantations due to many illnesses such as dysentery and smallpox. So I continued by publishing anonymously many of my poems against slavery in Bristol's newspaper. We believe that changing the minds in Parliament must first begin with changing the heart of our nation. So I continue by writing my most famous poem entitled Slavery, in which I waged war with my pen. One such reader of my writings wrote me a letter saying, "What a pleasure must afford you, my dear Madame, to have the power of producing such a moral improvement by your own writings, not only throughout Europe, but throughout Asia also. For I am convinced that your writings have had a greater effect and have been more generally read than the works which have been written for the last 100 years. Wilberforce later writes his last petition to Parliament, which is debated for 3 months. Finally, on the 26th of July, 1833, the Emancipation Bill is passed within the House of Commons, declaring that all slaves in the British Empire be set free within the next year. My dear friend of 47 years, William Wilberforce, and dearest abolitionist, died 3 days later. His famous words still echo today. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. So now, students, let us recite a portion of my poem, Slavery. And thou, great source of nature and of grace, who of one blood didst form the human race, look down upon thee in thy chosen time, with equal eye on Afric's suffering clime. Disperse her shades of intellectual night. Repeat thy highest behest, let there be light. Bring each benighted soul, great God, to thee, and with thy wide salvation, make them free. It should be held as an eternal truth that what is morally wrong can never be politically right.